So today's talk is going to be about the history of Chushi Gangdruk, but it starts with a question of why is this history not known? And actually starts with that as a statement as well, that the history of Chushi Gangdruk, even today in 2015, remains not as well known as it should be. And you might say not well known by whom? And certainly by people in the Tibetan community, as well as people out. But also by the folks who you might think would know this history. So by people within the Khampa community, the Chushi Gangdruk history remains not as well known as one might expect. Even, however, within families, so young Tibetans whose fathers, whose uncles, whose grandfathers served in Chushi Gangdruk often don't really know the story of the army. They might know about the name, kind of loosely, but not really know what happened. And I can't tell you how many times I was doing interviews when someone would come in and sit down in the room to listen to an interview that I was doing with someone who could have been their husband, could have been their father, maybe it was just a close friend. And then afterwards to say to me, I've known this person for 20 years, for 30 years, and I've never heard these stories before. And the first time it happened, I took note, but then again and again when I was doing interviews, people would say to me, I've never heard these stories before. And they were being told by close friends and family members. After one session, a young woman said to me, usually we just sit around gossiping or talking about the weather. Things that are universal pastimes. Okay, so the question for me became, well, why is this? Right? Why is this history not known? And there are several reasons. So one, clearly, is that the Tibetans did not win. So in Chushi Gangdruk's struggle against the People's Liberation Army, they were not successful, right? The numbers clearly were not on their side. They were outnumbered by such a large amount. However, if we look through history, we know that battles, especially battles fought in defense of one's nation and community, often become part of national stories, regardless of whether or not an army has won or has lost. So these stories are commonly, part of national historical traditions. So there's one reason, however. Sorry. Another is the current Tibetan policy of nonviolence. Right? When you have a political policy of nonviolence, it becomes very hard to narrate a history of war. Right? How do you talk about war when you are supposed to be nonviolent? How do you account for the fact that war was in defense of Buddhism, right, which has been generalized and romanticized as a religion that has nonviolence as some sort of genetic component of it? The third thing is the connection to the CIA. And how does this sound? Does it sound better? Okay, good. The CIA was involved in supporting and training the Chushi Gangdruk army. So providing financial support. We're getting more feedback. Hello?
Lower the volume maybe. Reduce the volume.
It's too loud. Switch hands. I think that's hard if you're lefty.
I'm holding too many. Can you just advance the slide when I tell you to? Yeah. Testing.
Oh, yeah.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay, let me try again. So the CIA partially funded the Chushi Gangdruk army, provided supplies, provided training, both in Saipan, in Virginia for a short while, and then in Colorado in the United States for a period of over 6 years. And as with pretty much every single operation connected to the CIA, this mission was top secret, and actually was for many years, so that you were not allowed to talk about it. So given that, there's also a reason why this history might be unknown. All of these three reasons are part of the story of why Chushi Gangdruk is unknown. But I argue that there's actually another reason, and one that is actually more deeply rooted in the Tibetan community. And this is the fact that the Chushi Gangdruk army was composed mostly, not entirely, but mostly of Khampas, that is, of people from Kham, from the eastern Tibetan region of Kham. And given some of the kind of long-standing relationships between the different regions of Tibet and Lhasa, so think of Tibet as kind of a social field, a religious field, but a political entity that was not always on good terms with one another, whether it was within a payul, whether it was across, neighboring payuls, or whether it was between different regions and Lhasa. That relation was constantly being worked out and often existed in times of friction. Right? So region and the association of Chushi Gangdruk with Kham has been one of the main reasons, I think, that the history remains unknown. So this will be the big part of the talk. Okay, so the challenge that Kham posed, right, to the center, to what we would call in English the status quo, are those people who had held power for so long, which in Tibet was the central Tibetan aristocracy. Kham, as the eastern Tibetan region, kind of brash, uncouth, young upstarts, they were not the ones who were supposed to be running the government. And yet Chushi Gangdruk was interested in being more than an army. The men who composed Chushi Gangdruk were also interested actually in participating in the government, participating in their country in a new way, in a way that would kind of bring Tibet, not just enable Tibet to maintain her independence, but also bring Tibet into the modern world. So what I argue, based on lots of research, is that this history has been arrested. And the concept of a history being arrested and not just swept under the rug or not just forgotten is the idea that it's postponed, right? That the history is out there somewhere, but you know that you're not supposed to tell it, that you can't talk about it. But a time will come later when it's okay to talk about this history, when it might be revealed. And there's elements of the Terre tradition that might kind of circulate in here as well. For those of you in the room who know about the Terre tradition, religious scholars believe that actually developed out of a political practice, where politically important but controversial documents were buried to be dug up later when a time was right, that then kind of morphed into a religious tradition. And as perhaps everyone in the room knows, the relationship between religion and politics, right, is long and deep in Tibet. So the idea that a time will come later is actually in some ways the time that we're in now. Right? So when someone is arrested, when we talk about a person, eventually, hopefully, they are released. And I think right now we're in the period of release, when the arrest of this history is slowly, gradually, but tenuously, and not without some controversy, starting to be told. So there have been a number of books that have been written about Chushi Gangdruk, including by Chushi Gangdruk soldiers. Poems have been written, including by someone sitting right here in front of me, who was part of the army. A film has been made. There have been numerous stories. Scholars like myself have come and started studying Tibet, the army. And so you might say, well, with all of this, right, with the fact that people like, Songkha Lhasang Tsering has written, Ratu Ngawang has written a book, Jamyang Norbu has written, several books. I could go on and on. There are books in English, there are books in Tibetan. Why are you saying we still don't know this history? And the thing is that the history is starting to come out, but has not become part of official history. So Chushi Gangdruk's history still resides kind of at the level of just personal story or regional story, but not yet the story of Tibet. Right? And why is that? Can you advance? In many ways, the key person, actually, to the story of Chushi Gangdruk history is His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So when a history is arrested, there's a whole series of processes that happen, right, through which individuals know that they are not supposed to tell this story. And in the case of the Dalai Lama, if he is someone who's involved in kind of communicating to the Tibetan community what they are supposed to do and what they are not supposed to do, it's often as much as through what he does not say as what he does say, right? Or actions, who he chooses to meet with, who he doesn't meet with, right? So all of the sorts of ways that you can communicate in words and through other sorts of actions. And it's been very clear for several decades now to Chushi Gangdruk, the moments when they are kind of in trouble with His Holiness and the moments when they've moved into a different phase of their relationship. What they are looking for is actually very similar to what many Tibetans are looking for in some form, which is his blessing, right? His recognition, his acknowledgement of this story. They know also and work very hard to make sure that their actions bring no harm to him. Right? So this also is one of those elements of tension and elements of friction that actually persists through so much of the Tibetan exile community, but is very much an activated part in the present of the relationship of Chushi Gangdruk to the Dalai Lama. And in thinking about the concept of arrested histories in the Tibetan exile community, just kind of in general and beyond Chushi Gangdruk, I should share with you that actually for a long time, it took me a while. I think I've been doing research for probably a year and a half before I came on to what was going on. And it happened in the moment when His Holiness first went to Taiwan. And I was having a conversation with a Chushi Gangdruk veteran that day, and we were talking about how, you couldn't talk about Taiwan. For so long, that had been something, it was a forbidden topic, right? It was arrested. You couldn't talk about it. And he said, but now that His Holiness has gone to Taiwan for the first time, now we can talk about Taiwan. And this was roughly with 94, 95, I forget the exact year. And since then, what's happened? Now we have, the number of Tibetans residing in Taiwan has skyrocketed. The relationships between the two countries have changed. Right? But it was that moment, right? This action by the Dalai Lama of going to Taiwan that then made that relationship, that historical relationship, but also the relationship in the present shift. An example of a history that still remains arrested is that of Bhutan, and the story of what happened between Tibetans and the King of Bhutan in the early 70s. And because it's still arrested, I'll probably just leave it there for right now. I say a little more in my book, which is in the back, but I don't want to go in too deep. So this is a concept that has, exists in several corners of life here. It's also something that is not just Tibetan, right? Many societies have ways of dealing with histories or dealing with pasts, right? Things that have happened that they don't want yet to become history, but that perhaps they don't fully want to forget. So a category of troubled history. So this talk is going to be, again, about why Chushi Gangdruk history is so unknown, how this happens, right? How do you collectively, as a group, forget a history? And with what repercussions, right? What happens? What fills in the gap of a history that's not remembered, right? What history is created in its place? And first, what I want to do, however, is kind of give you a little bit of a history of Chushi Gangdruk, because I've kind of skipped over that and gone to the heart of the talk first. But also, beyond what Sela and Josnav said, tell you a little more about who I am and why this Inji Pumo is standing here before you today. So I hold a PhD in anthropology and history, and so I'm both an anthropologist and a historian, meaning that I both study the past, but then also study the way that history is part of culture and culture is part of history, that they can't go together without one or the other. And so what that means is that for my research, I draw it on both fields, or drew, on both fields. Both doing historical research, lots of reading of documents, translating of things from Tibetan into English, doing lots of oral history interviews. I sat down with over 100 veterans living throughout Nepal and India, but also did what we call in anthropology fieldwork, which means that you go and you live within a community. So actually, for most of my research, I stayed with a Tibetan family in Kathmandu, in Bodha. The Pala is from Litang and had been in Chushi Gangdruk, the Amalo is from Markham. So if you're going to study Chushi Gangdruk, who better to stay with than a Kampa family, right, who had been in Chushi Gangdruk. And wherever I went, actually, that connection was key. Not just in terms of, making introductions, but when I would travel, say, from Kathmandu to Kalimpong, everyone there would want to know, who do you stay with, right? Who is that? Okay, he's friends with so-and-so, he serves so-and-so, what payul is he from? And from all of those sorts of social connections, right, then they could place me as not just a student from America, but as someone who had an understanding, a growing one, evolving one, right, of this political history. I would go from Kathmandu to Kalimpong to Darjeeling, fly to Delhi, spend a lot of time in Majnu-Katila, come up here to Dharamsala, fly back to Kathmandu, go to Pokhara. I did this research from 1994 to 1999, and spending much time each year in those sites, and then going back to the United States from time to time. So the bulk of this research was completed in 1999, 15 years ago. And yet the story of Chushi Gangdruk continued, right? So even though now I am no longer living over here doing this research, the story continues, but also many of, not necessarily the veterans, but many of their children have immigrated to the United States and Canada. So in some ways, Chushi Gangdruk now is as present in North America as it is in South Asia. So the history begins in one way. There are many starting points. I'm going to start with the bombing of the monasteries in Kham in the 1950s, so roughly around 1956. Batang Monastery, Chating, Litang. Monasteries throughout Kham were bombed, by the Chinese aircraft flying overhead, dropping bombs on monasteries. My book is a drawing of all of these things done by a Chushi Gangdruk soldier. So kind of the art of war, right? And the art of this destruction, right? A destruction of religion that continues to this day, right? In some ways. Originally, different families, and I say families, not men, rose up throughout Kham, because this is where these actions started first, to defend the monasteries, to defend the monks, to defend their families, to defend their leaders. First, they just did it where they were in their own town, in their own village. Then they started coordinating, right, from village to village, from payul to payul, right, connecting up. They did so primarily under the name Tensung Danglagmang, right? The idea that this is a volunteer army to defend Buddhism. As time went on, the names started shifting. And so sometimes we see in the written documents, not just Tensung Danglagmang, but Tensi Danglagmang. So the army to defend religion and nation and country, right, and government. Eventually, the PLA grew too strong in Kham, and so the Khampas had to flee inwards toward Lhasa. In Lhasa is where they ended up joining forces with other Tibetans, with troops from Amdo, and there were battalions and troops in the army from Amdo. There were a bunch from Utsang who joined in. There were a bunch of Tibetan army soldiers who actually quit the Tibetan army to join with Chushi Gangdruk. There were a handful of nationalist Chinese soldiers who were fleeing the communists who joined with Chushi Gangdruk. And there was even a Chinese soldier named Jemi Lhasang Tsering, right, Jia Lhasang Tsering, who lived in the south in Bailakupi, I believe, until his death. Right? Several Uyghurs are also said to have joined into fighting. So I say it was mostly Khampa army, even though there are other people involved. Both then and now, the army has been primarily associated with Kham. Okay, could you do the next slide? In 1958, on June 16th, the army officially constituted itself with a new name through a ceremony that was held. It was a long life ceremony for the Dalai Lama, in which they had collected money from all of the wealthy traders, mostly Khampas, but also others, and anyone who wanted to donate, and created a gold throne for the Dalai Lama. Oh, sorry, can you go to the next slide? This is the flag. This is the one I wanted. This is Andru Gopotashi. So Andru Tsang, so taking that as the official name for the army. Next slide, so. It was at this time that the army became a male-only domain. Right? And so in many ways, this is a very gendered history, and it is a masculine history. Prior to the formation of Chushi Gangdruk in Lhasa, women had been part of the people who had fought. They had been involved in getting supplies to men up in the field. Ama Ade writes about this in her autobiography. But other women were also involved, including many women whose names we have forgotten. Dorje Yudun in Nyaron. Was involved in leading a rebellion against troops there. Who else? Beri Laga, who lived in Dharamsala for many years, and many, many other women. At the time of the formation of the official army, however, then again it became a masculine domain, and there are all sorts of reasons for this that we could talk about after if people are interested. But one of them had to do with the concept of pollution, and specifically about the concept of women's sexual power, kind of defeat our lessening male power on the battlefield. So it's, in some ways, a common story of women's sexual power being feared by men, and in other ways, it's a very particular Tibetan story of ideas about bodily substances and fluids. All right. Next photo. In 1959, this part I think everyone probably knows, His Holiness escaped. I learned this morning that not everyone knows, not all Tibetans know, that his escape was actually via the escort of Chushi Gangdruk soldiers. I had thought perhaps at least that part was known by people in the Tibetan community, but learned this morning that it's not. So the Dalai Lama was escorted on his trip by Chushi Gangdruk soldiers who made sure that he was safe as best that they could, and he did indeed make it to India. They were also telegraphing back and forth with the CIA on this journey. So the CIA actually, had information coming to them the entire time, knowing where the Dalai Lama was on his route. This is Camp Hale in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. So when the CIA got involved, they were interested basically in one thing. And I'm American, so I'm going to tell it like it is. They were interested in trying to be a thorn in the side of the communists. Right? The United States government did not provide sufficient support to Chushi Gangdruk or to the Tibetan government, to really stop the Chinese from taking over. That was never their goal. What they did was to provide enough assistance to enable Chushi Gangdruk to continue, right? To maintain its raids into Tibet, to try and to capture intelligence, to maybe try and, take down some Chinese battalions, but not to fully regain Tibet. This is one of the places, this is the primary place actually, where the CIA trained several thousand, we don't exactly know the numbers, Tibetan soldiers from 1958 through 1964. It's at roughly 11,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies. They had first tried to train Tibetans in Virginia at sea level, which did not work. And so very quickly found a new location and brought them up into the mountains. And this was actually tucked away behind several valleys. So it was not visible from the road at all, and no one knew what was going on. So no one knew the Tibetans were there. All right, Dow can go through. Okay, here's just some soldiers there. So this is Tibetan soldiers training in the USA. Here we see, this is actually Ken Knaus, who has written 2 books about his time as a CIA teacher with the Tibetans. This looks like a lesson on world geography. I don't know if you can see in the back, there's a map on the board there. Here we see Bruce Walker, who was one of the only CIA agents who studied some Tibetan. He actually did so at the University of Washington, posing as a graduate student, which is why professors and grad students, sometimes we do get mistaken for CIA agents. I say, I just study the CIA, I am not of them. But he actually did, and he was at University of Washington the same time that Gene Smith was. They were co-students there. Okay. And here we just see a couple of the soldiers, and that's again Bruce Walker sitting around fire. By all accounts, and I've interviewed many more Tibetan soldiers than I have CIA officers, but I've interviewed about 20 CIA officers as well. And all of them remember this time together in the camp as one that was deeply meaningful for them. The Tibetans genuinely felt support from these American teachers, and that's how they referred to them, Gigan, right? That these are our teachers. They didn't, I think maybe they hoped that would extend to the US government, but their relationship with America, with the US, was really this personalized one. And the American CIA officers, and I will be honest, which is not a group I had ever anticipated spending a lot of time with, they fell in love. And those are the words that they use with the Tibetans, and tell me repeatedly that the Tibet operation was unlike any other they ever worked on before. And most CIA operations do not involve a grassroots, homegrown partner. It's often the CIA creating the partner they're going to work with. And so I think that sense of a true Tibetan commitment to their cause was something that many of the CIA officers really respected, and in turn have actually made some lifelong commitments of their own to Tibet. So it really actually stands apart in some ways. Does not mean it is immune to criticism, but has a very special place actually in the agency's history. Okay. After His Holiness escaped from Tibet, so too did many Tibetans. Right here we are in Dharamsala, but also many Chushi Gangdruk soldiers came out as well. One of the things that they did was to reorganize themselves, kind of based in Darjeeling, and found, kind of through CIA assistance, a new military base in Mustang, which is in Nepal and is a kind of former, still actually kingdom, but it was a former Tibetan kingdom, so the kingdom of Lo with its own king that had been part of the Tibetan polity, both socially and religiously, as well as kind of having a political allegiance to Lhasa. In some ways, this was the perfect place. In other ways, it was really too far west, to really be in the right place to deal with this, with the Chinese army. Nonetheless, starting from the early 60s all the way through 1974, this is where Chushi Gangdruk in exile had their military base. And it was from here that they did conduct raids into Tibet, mostly on Chinese convoys, right, on different trucks coming in and capturing intelligence and shooting out tires and shooting at drivers. Can we do the next one? This is actually, this is Tendar here in the front, who lived in Kathmandu until recently, and preparing guns for a raid in Tibet. This is actually from a still from a controversial film that was made by George Patterson, the Scottish missionary turned journalist. Next. There was also a branch of Chushi Gangdruk right here in India. And so here we have young men in the 1960s from the 22 unit, right? So Establishment 22, SFF, Special Frontier Force, which is still around today. And so this is part of the Indian Army, but for those Tibetans in Mustang and Tibetans in Darjeeling, this was really a brother, right, or kind of cousin organization. They were absolutely tied together in important ways. Next photo. Actually, can go back, Don. And let me just come back to 222 here, to SFF. So the SFF, and many of you know, still exists today. And actually, service in Establishment 22 was compulsory for young Tibetans for a long time, including for women. So there are women who serve here mostly in non-military positions, but receive full military training, including parachuting and all sorts of training. And for a very long time has been a source of opportunities, career opportunity, educational opportunity for Tibetans in exile. Slowly kind of moving in a different direction now for the community, but still here, and not widely known by the Indian public. So not only did this unit fight in Bangladesh and was a major unit in the success of kind of the Bangladesh war, but Tibetan soldiers also fought in Kargil in the 90s. And I was here at the time, and I remember every day on the Indian news you would see images, of troops going to the family, knocking on the door of whether the parents of a deceased soldier or the widow of a deceased soldier, and not for Tibetans, right? So Tibetan deaths in Kargil, Tibetan deaths in the battlefield for the Indian Army are not publicly announced, right? This is all something that is very quiet, that is done respectfully, but is done privately and behind closed doors. And when Indian citizens find out this, it's often quite surprising to them. Perhaps different for Indians here in Dharamsala, right? But in many other places of India, absolutely unknown. So Chushi Gangdruk, as I mentioned before, was a military organization, but had bigger aspirations. And for many of those Tibetan men who were part of the army, this was the first time that they felt they could contribute to their country, right? Not just be a trader contributing, to their family, or maybe, earning enough money to really support their local monastery and Lama, but now contributing something to Tibet. And Khampas had not been able to contribute something to Tibet in that sense before on this scale. And so when Chushi Gangdruk came out, right, and was based in Darjeeling, they even put forward a proposal, right, to the Tibetan government, to the Kashag, that there should be a representative from Chushi Gangdruk in each of the different ministries, right, that Chushi Gangdruk should be represented in the government. That did not happen. But that gives you a sense of how they saw themselves as part of the country in a new way. Right? That this was really enabling a new sort of subject, right? Not just someone living in a faraway part of the country, but people coming together in the same space, including the same political space, in a new way. A lot of this comes through in their writings, and most of their writings have not yet been made public, including by me. So I'm going to share with you now some images that I don't yet have permission to publish, but I can show you here. Okay? And the reason I don't have permission to publish them is actually somewhat silly. Right? These should be in the public domain, what I'm about to show you. These are created by Tibetans, but the CIA for a long time has held them in their possession, and so hasn't made them available, to any of us in this room. Give me the next one, slide. Oh, here we go. Actually, go back. Okay. So what we see here is, I'm going to show you several slides, several panels from an illustrated history book that Chushi Gangdruk soldiers made while they were in Colorado. And they made a bunch of these books. I've collected 5 of them so far, in which what they've done is basically illustrated the history of Tibet in different registers. There's one about the history of the world. There's a volume that's the history of Chushi Gangdruk. And they took these and they brought them into Tibet. And they were trying to distribute these books to different regions, to different villages, to try and educate people. So what we see here is on our left, a group of monks, and on the right, a group of laymen, right, together raising the flag, saying, let's establish, right, a new country. And democracy was actually very much a part of the rhetoric, of the language that they use in these volumes. Democracy, education, and independence. Kind of these 3 words circulate throughout the volumes again and again. And I will, remind us all that this was during the late 1950s and early 1960s, during the Cold War, right, when they're sitting in classrooms with American teachers, right, who are teaching them communism bad, democracy good, right? But you can really see the way that this comes through. Let me see the next one. All right, so here's an image. So this is what from these are all the images I'm showing you are actually from the same book. And this is one showing the bombing of the monastery. So you can see at the top, the plane dropping bombs. Down here on our right, there's a tank shooting. And over here, we actually have the predecessor to Charlie Hebdo, I think. We have a caricature, actually, of a Chinese soldier. And there are kind of grotesque, unflattering caricatures of Chinese soldiers throughout these books. So someone, myself perhaps, is going to do a lot of writing about this when the time comes. But basically here saying, so the word used here, you probably can't read it in the back, is nyamtung, right? The idea that Tibetans are naive, that Tibetans are simple, right? And that the Chinese have this idea and they're just going to kind of take over, right, religion with the ideas of socialism. Here we see, this is actually one of my favorite drawings, I think because we see them all from the back, right? Everyone here, we see them moving, they're in motion, they're going off to fight, and there's just something about the symmetry and the movement in this picture from 1956 on, right? So again, 1956 when the bombing of those monasteries happened. And here we see, going to fight, foot soldiers and on horseback alone. You can also see the type of armor and weapons here that the Tibetans have versus what the Chinese had. There are no planes and there are no tanks, right? So another way, in addition to the fact that there were just so many more Chinese soldiers than there were Tibetan soldiers, the Chinese had, planes and tanks and just modern weaponry beyond anything that the Tibetans had. Okay, next one. Here we see an image of the Dalai Lama, right, making his escape, going from Tibet. And here again we see the Chinese soldier in that caricature image. And then Nehru in India receiving his holiness with a kata. And a bird of peace, right, flying overhead. Okay, next one. This slide is kind of loosely titled, What Tibetans Must Do From Now On for the Sake of Tibetan Independence. This is from this is undated, so I don't know when it's from. It's roughly like 1961, 1962, right? What Tibetans must do for the sake of independence. What we have here, you can see men from the different regions, right? Chokasum, right? And a monk. In some ways, the calls for unity, the calls for monks and lay people to work together, the calls for kampas, for amduas, for utsangbas to come together, in some ways are exactly what we are hearing again now in this post-2008 period, right? After the protests of 2008 and in this time of self-immolations, one of the biggest kind of grounding and rallying calls coming out of Tibet has been that, right? Tibetans unite across the 3 provinces. And here we have it. And from 1959, to 2008, kind of the 2 big protests, of this, the last 60 years. There are many more. In addition to these books, I have also found and translated all sorts of things, actually, out of the Tibetan language newspaper in Kalimpong, Yochuk Sosur Soji Melon, which we usually in English refer to as the Tibet Mirror. And this was the newspaper that Tarchung Babu printed and published for so many years. And Chushi Gangdruk published lots of proclamations in Melon, in Tibetan, calling Tibetans to stand up, rise up together, Tibetans of the 3 provinces. The language that they use is deeply religious. It's deeply symbolic. It calls on all of the sorts of things you would expect. These proclamations read as the sort of documents that any country would be proud to have, would have school children learn, that politicians might stand and read or at least quote from, that people would know. And yet, as I was doing my research, and it was, again, Tashi Tsering, who's out of town right now, but who was helping me with much of this, and he said, no one has looked at Melon. So much of this is in Melon. Go and look and see what you can find. All right? And he was right, surprise. They still haven't been published. Well, actually, I've published them in my book, okay? But this all still remains mostly unknown. These are things from 1959, published that summer, just after His Holiness escapes, that are still not taught in Tibetan schools, where history still mostly remains the 3 Dharma kings, but not necessarily the history of right now, right, and of what's happening in the Tibetan community now. So what happens, right, when histories are forgotten? Right? What happens when they remain in the archives, or in some pile of newspapers on someone's desk? Or for those of you who've been to Kalimpong and, the Tarchin's little Mackenzie cottage there, I think it's a, 8 mile or so, right? You can walk right past it. The end of Chushi Gangdruk as a military organization took place in 1974, right? Although we know that SFF continued. But Chushi Gangdruk as Chushi Gangdruk, right, as an army, ended in 1974. And the end was not pretty, right? The end was actually quite ugly. It involved the deaths of a number of beloved leaders. It involved a split, between different men and different battalions in Mustang that morphed into actually a split of several groups, mostly those associated with Bhod Gyalo, but not just him, from Dharamsala. Right, and the establishment, actually, and kind of excommunication of some Tibetan groups in Nepal. Have the next slide down. Over the next several decades, or at least certainly the next 2, so we go from 1974 to 1984 to 94, right, to 2015, where we are today, many of these soldiers slowly turned into old men. And ended up basically becoming just anonymous within their community. They were not known in their community, right? I could go, so I lived in Bodha for most of my research, and do Kora. And except when Baba Yeshi came, and then everyone sort of got really quiet at Bodha when people are doing Kora. But for the most part, it was just veterans, going round and round, and they were just themselves in their community. People who weren't Kampas did not know who they were, had no idea who they were. Many Kampas just kind of knew, that's my Pola's buddy, right? They were Chushi Gangdruk together. But still didn't necessarily know the history, didn't know what or why, right, or how all this mattered so much. There's a sadness, to all of this. So this organization that had been devoted to defending Buddhism, defending the Dalai Lama, defending Tibet, turned to a social welfare organization And this is the way that Chushi Gangdruk exists now, right, officially, is as a social welfare organization. In Nepal, there's also the Lotik, which helps to kind of provide some small funds and some support to veterans there. But there is no official veterans organization of the Tibetan government. Veterans don't receive a pension. There's no Veterans Day, for example, a community that, a national holiday we celebrate in the United States. And here in Dharamsala, I'm told actually that Chushi Gangdruk right now, one of the successes that they're doing is running a day school for Tibetans mostly who have come recently from Tibet to study English, right? So really, again, trying to move into this domain of social welfare. There's a lot of emotion involved in all of this for many of the veterans. And the emotion comes in one way because of the importance of the Dalai Lama to this. Right, and clearly the deep faith, right, the devotion, right, to him that most all of the veterans have. For pretty much every single veteran with whom I've spoke, their service in Chushi Gangdruk, right, and again that service, that religious service, was seen as the most important thing they had done in their life. A couple of the men I interviewed were ones who had been escorts for the Dalai Lama, on his escape. And so it was one thing to be a member of Chushi Gangdruk kind of fighting for Tibet in general, but for those men, it got even closer. They had been his escort, right? And that was something, that just lodged in them, that was what they had done, right? And yet, they couldn't talk about this, right? They couldn't tell this story, or at least they couldn't tell the story in a way that their community would hear as important, right? As something that truly mattered, without it being some sort of struggle. There was always hope, right? Hope that someday, and maybe that day is going to be very soon, that this history can be told. But also a fear, all right? A fear that maybe it's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen before I die. A fear also among all of the veterans with whom I spoke, of not being able to return to Tibet, right? Of dying in a foreign country, right? Of not being able to reunite with family members you've left behind, your parents, often sisters, whose brothers were usually fighting with you, right? And many times children. A number of the soldiers had left behind children in Tibet who they never saw again. But also just the idea of going back and being in your home, right? Of making tea with milk from your own animals, right? Of eating shop meat, again, right? From Tibet, not from a butcher down the street. Seeing the flowers. Just all of these real evocative, sensory, just little memories that are so big, right? We're part of these stories. So these stories of war were often also stories, of poetry and of longing and of little details. Of all of the things that make home, home, and not somewhere else. There was also a wistfulness, right, and a kind of resignment. And some of that also is because of that relationship to the Dalai Lama, right? And so it must be okay, and this is what we must do. Also a lot of atoning for sins committed on the battlefield. Again, Lhasang Tsering, who some of you might know. Litangba, who was in Mustang and who had trained in Colorado, and who was one of the most decorated among his colleagues, as someone who was kind of fearless. I did a series of interviews with him. Actually, he was one of the people I spent the most time with. And one time we were just sitting there, and we had known each other for, 3 or 4 years at this point, maybe longer. And he said to me, I sometimes wondered why I was killing all these Chinese. What good would this do? A number of the soldiers had been monks before joining with Chushi Gangdruk. And to my knowledge, they generally did not return to being monks. It was sort of once a monk, then a soldier, and then you're a lay person. But there were actually several who had been lay people before the war, and after the war was over then became monks, to better try and to make offerings, right? To try and, to make right many of the things that they had done. And so every single veteran with whom I met was incredibly devout and often had altars, beyond anything I had seen in other Tibetan homes, and Tibetan altars in general are very elaborate, but had ones that were just particularly activated and engaged, and in which much, I think, hope was invested. I began my research on this in 1994. And this was also a year that there was a big controversy in Chushi Gangdruk. So this was when Atar Nobu, who was a Litangba, who at the time was living in Majid Katila, and a group of other veterans signed an agreement with the Taiwanese Association of Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs. And they had done this, as they explained to me and to other people, in the hopes that His Holiness would be happy, that this would be something positive for the Tibetan government. And I think you see right there in that moment, that idea again of being part of the community, right, of being part of the country, and yet clearly making a decision that did not go over very well at all. His Holiness was furious, right, when he heard of this. And a big falling out ensued, including the creation of two separate Chushi Gangdruk groups, Sarpa and Nyingma, right? So a new one and an old one. This was not the first time there had been a controversy within Chushi Gangdruk community. Right? There had been all sorts of disputes, during the 60s on the battlefield in Mustang. There had been nasty battles, actually, between some of the men in Mustang. There had been disputes within the community in the early 1970s around the 13 camp issue and all United Party. So again, it was not the first time. And yet, as we grew further and further away from Tibet, right, from 1959, now in 1994, right, it felt kind of like there was a new sadness, a new hardness to this. People who had been friends forever, who had been friends from before the war, ended up becoming enemies in this moment. And then this was when I was starting my research, so I'm trying to figure this all out. Chushi Gangdruk, what's going on? And I remember there would be days where I would have breakfast in the morning, right, at Litang Atar's house, and then have lunch at Ratung Nawang's house, like the same day, and just going back and forth. And these were two men, again, both Litangbas, who had fought together side by side, and who were now on opposite sides, right, of this divide. So these controversies in the community were important when they were within the group, kind of internal, but even more troubled and problematic when they were controversies between Chushi Gangdruk and His Holiness and the Tibetan government. And so that's what happened in 1994. So in 2001, His Holiness called the Chushi Gangdruk groups kind of here to Dharamsala, let's talk. Everyone came, all of the veterans I knew in Kathmandu came. The Pala, the family I stayed with, whose name is Lhasang Tsering, told me afterwards that they were all just so happy to be in the presence of His Holiness, to be having things made somewhat right, maybe not fully right, but to be moving forward. That when His Holiness asked them, if there's anything you need, just let me know what it is you need. He said, we all said, oh, no, everything's okay, right? We don't need anything. And then he started laughing, saying all of these veterans are desperately poor, and they all really do need a lot. He said, but in that moment, everyone said, no, there's nothing we need. Thank you just being here, right? Having you call the two groups together. That's your gift to us. Oh, no, sorry, go back. Are we already there? Whoops. I didn't realize that was it. June 16th, you might recall, was the day in 1958 when the Chushi Gangdruk army was officially formed in Lhasa. What many Tibetans don't know is that June 16th remains an important day for Chushi Gangdruk, and is a day that is commemorated with a ceremony right here in Dharamsala. And now that the Chushi Gangdruk community has moved elsewhere, is celebrated every June 16th. Well, actually, it's in the United States now, so we do it on a Saturday, right? So every Saturday, which may or may not be the 16th, might be 17th or 18th, in Queens. So this is a photo from, I think this was from 2012, so this is in New York City. And you can see on the right, the Chushi Gangdruk flag. On the left, the Tibetan flag. Can I see the next one? And then here, part of the ceremony. So they're making offerings to, you can't see it, but the image is of, there's an image of Andrew Gopatashi and an image of His Holiness. Right, and so these are the elected officers of Chushi Gangdruk making their offerings here. And we have the flag, yeah, all three flags, US flag, Tibet, Chushi Gangdruk, and then the offerings. I'm told that in Dharamsala, that currently, or at least most recently, all of the Kidu from Kham come on June 16th for the Chushi Gangdruk commemoration of this day, which is not always the case before. But that other members of the community, so I guess Amdawas and Sangbas and other people, are not yet celebrating this. And this was the same when I was doing my research. I remember, I think I was here in 1998, 99 for the ceremonies here in Dharamsala. And at that time, the only people who came, it seemed, were Chushi Gangdruk themselves. They were not yet representative from Kidu just in general, but it was just Chushi Gangdruk and their immediate family. All right, so kind of things are moving. And yet, there's, come back to the question of emotion, sometimes some bitterness. So when I was doing my research, one older veteran in Majnu Katila said to me, March 10th is not the real fight for Tibet. The real fight for Tibet was on June 16th. So everyone celebrates March 10th instead. No one even knows about June 16th. Right, and places for bitterness, places for critique, sometimes are probably hard to lodge within you, but even harder to speak publicly, right? Bitterness is actually probably not an emotion that's well received in any culture, but definitely, not necessarily one here either. Well, what the veterans want from His Holiness, right, the recognition of their history, is in many ways the same thing that they would like from their fellow Tibetans. And so actually I gave a talk at Harvard last April. And afterwards, and it was a talk actually on the self-immolations in Tibet, and afterwards a young Tibetan college student came up to me. And he said, Professor, I'm reading your book and I'm almost done with it. And he said, I didn't know any of this before. And what he said to me next told me that we are now in a time of change. He said, I want to have a June 16th celebration in Boston. And his family is not a Chushi Gangdruk family. And he carried it through. So what you see here is, to my knowledge, the first ever non-Chushi Gangdruk organization, or non-Chushi, the next one down, sorry. The first ever non-Chushi Gangdruk celebration of June 16th. And you can see actually on the screen, you can kind of see they've Skyped in Jamyon Norbu, who gave them a talk about Chushi Gangdruk as part of what they were doing. And this is a group of Tibetans and non-Tibetans. It was open to the entire kind of Boston Tibetan and also Friends of Tibet community. And I was in Nepal at the time, so I was not there, but supposedly by all accounts, it was a success. This is exactly the sort of thing, when I think back 20 years to the veterans with whom I was working, many of whom have passed away by now and are no longer here, the idea that a group of young Tibetans, who's Pala or Pola or Ashal or anyone, were not Chushi Gangdruk, organized this event would have been in some ways not necessarily unthinkable, but something they would have dreamed for but not expected to happen. So I see this actually as a sign that really we are in a sort of new time in terms of at least a younger generation, including Students for Free Tibet who's organized this talk, right? Being interested in this history and wanting to learn about what happened in the past in order to try and envision perhaps new strategies for the future. So the significance of Chushi Gangdruk, there are many, many things. The concept of sacrifice, which is something we see again now with the self-immolators, right? This idea of sacrifice, kind of in some ways of offering different sorts of things, but related in some ways. A bravery that is undeniable and undisputable. Although, again, many of the veterans with whom I talked would confide to me after we'd known each other for a long while that actually they were scared to death when they were on the battlefield. One man who I called, who was a popo to my family, Popo Dada, said to me one day, Gen Losam Jampa, the man I was telling you about before, said he could ride his horse shooting, at a million things and hitting them all, hitting every single target as he was riding past it. And he said, me, I fell off my horse every time. I was so scared. right? So also kind of bringing down to the ground and putting it into real human bodies. You know, the idea that some sort of kampa bravado or bravery is just, again, genetic, versus being a really deeply felt commitment and passion that people had to try and get something done. And someone like Popa Dada doing this anyways, despite he was scared to death, as he told me many times. This service, and again, the service, I think, was really the way that the veterans, as I understood it, saw what they did, is not always seen that way by the Tibetan community. Instead, there are other ways that Chushi Gangdruk is seen, right? As a problem, as something that needs to be, if not arrested, you know, maybe really pushed to the side and quieted and shut down, but not remembered, right? As an organization that has threatened too much. And yet the question remains, what exactly, you know, is it that they are threatening? Why is the question of region, right, of the different choka, right, so problematic, right? Why is choka supposed to be something, you know, that you, or a regional identity, something that you get past? And yet there are all of the ways that it really grounds community in exile, right? People still, you know, it's not as if 50 years later, Payul doesn't matter, or whether the difference between being Amdoa or being Kampa, you know, or being, you know, from Lhasang, or somewhere else, right, or being Turba, right? These are still identities and categories that matter. New ones have come in the exile community. Now it matters, you know, maybe what settlement or camp or town or neighborhood you're from, what school you went to, right? Sect or school of Buddhism has always mattered too, right? The question becomes, why do certain identities, affiliations, groupings become problematic? Which ones threaten power holders, right? And why? So the CIA has acknowledged the Tibetan operation, much to everyone's great surprise, actually. And this took place only through the insistence of Ken Knaus, the teacher who I showed you a while ago. So what you see here is actually, these are images from a ceremony that was held at Camp Hale, September 10th, 2010, where the CIA publicly acknowledged for the first time that it had funded the Tibetan guerrilla soldiers. Okay, can you go to the next photo? Okay, here you can see a group of Tibetans flew in, veterans and their families flew in from around the United States and Canada. You can see some of them here, prayer flags are up. We have the American and Tibetan flag. This is Colorado Senator Mark Udall, so a very important US Senator, so an elected official. He was the official host for this event. Okay, next one. And here's the plaque that was installed. I'll read it, in case those of you in the back can't see it. From 1958 to 1964, Camp Hale played an important role as a training site for Tibetan freedom fighters. Trained by the CIA, many of these brave men lost their lives in the struggle for freedom. They were the best and the bravest of their generation, and we wept together when they were killed fighting alongside their countrymen. And that's a quote from Ken Knaus's book, Orphans of the Cold War. And at the bottom it says, this plaque is dedicated to their memory. This is Doma Norbu, who was there representing her father, who was deceased at this time, Atar Norbu. And this actually was, so this is 2010, this ceremony is taking place. Sonam Yangzong was also there, who's the daughter of Ratu Ngawang. And for those of us standing there at the ceremony who knew the real history of kind of Chushi Gangdruk, which most of the CIA officers knew nothing about, they didn't know anything beyond kind of what they wanted to know. We knew who the fathers of these two women were. And in her speech that Doma Norbu gave, she spoke directly to Sonam Yangzong and said, we need to rebuild kind of the relationship between our families and between the different sides of Chushi Gangdruk. It is up to the next generation. Our fathers fought together for so long. And the recent controversy, we have to put it behind us. And it was an incredibly poignant and, again, tear-filled moment with these two women there representing, you know, their families. It was a very important moment for everyone there. So many veterans were there, representatives of the US government were there, I was there was some Tibetan media were there, and CIA officers were there. You might notice there was one group that was not there. There was no representative from the Dalai Lama present at the ceremony. So the CIA publicly acknowledged this operation, which is a very, very big deal in the United States for the CIA to do that. And there was no one there from Dharamsala, from the Office of Tibet. I want to end with a quote from a Tibetan whose name was Eddie during the war. So the CIA teachers gave all of the Tibetan soldiers English names. And Baba Lekshe, who for many years lived and went back and forth between Kalimpong and Kathmandu, we were talking one day, and he remembered out of the blue, oh yeah, I had an English name, I had an American name. And so I said, oh, well, what is it? And he couldn't remember it, and he was looking all around his room, and he was like taking out all these scraps of paper from different corners, and then in a pair of pants he had hanging somewhere, he reached in and pulled out a little piece of paper that was all folded up, and he opened it up, and in it said, Eddie. And he looked at me, he said, my name was Eddie. In Tibetan, we're talking this. Here's another quote from him. What he said to me one day as we were talking about Chushi Gangdruk is, go to this. Sorry, Jamyam Norvik. I thought I was done with this. Keep going. Sorry. Yes. Samsol at the end. Just go. Yeah, next one. All right. So what Baba Lekshe said was, without knowledge, one can only fight for small things. So without knowledge, one can only fight for small things. So in closing, I just want to echo his words to say, obtain knowledge and fight for big things. Thank you.
I have been requested by the students for a free Tibet on behalf of all of us, on behalf of my nation and my country, to say thank you for revealing this hidden history. Thank you. Now, for all Tibetans who are here, please remember, it is not just enough to know. We must continue to do what they began till Tibet is free. And if I may add one word, Professor did mention that members of Chushi Gangdruk escorted His Holiness into freedom to India. More importantly, it was because most of southern Tibet was under the control of Chushi Gangdruk that we now have His Holiness in freedom here to be not just our leader, but our guide, our hope, and our spirit. We thank Chushi Gangdruk for the fact that we have His Holiness here. We thank you, Professor,